Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online Adolescent Psychology class, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in cognitive transitions. Luckily this week I actually have my mic set up correctly, and it does not look like I'm filming inside of a cave. So, with that said, and with those adjustments made, let's jump into it. Beginning with some changes in cognition during adolescence. The term cognition refers to thinking. It can also be, it's kind of just what we kind of think of how the brain operates, thinking, kind of memory, attention, those kind of things. Compared to younger children, adolescents are more sophisticated in their ability to do the following. Thinking about possibilities, such as counterfactual thinking about abstract concepts, such as math, geometry. They think about what is possible, not just what is observed directly. They engage in if-then thinking. They think about thinking, which is referred to as metacognition, monitoring, which is defined as monitoring your own cognitive ability during the thinking process. They are better at monitoring what they are learning. They see things as relative, not as absolute. That is referred to as relativism. Young children's thinking tend to focus on the here and now, things they can directly observe. So we're going to break down each of these kind of differences or advances in cognition in adolescence momentarily. But kind of the big difference or something to keep in mind here is that adolescents literally think differently than younger children. Younger children kind of theorize to think really about kind of their immediate environment, not so much about what is happening in the future and kind of about not about kind of like different possibilities of the here and now. They just kind of accept reality as it is, or they don't think through what could have been. So again, kind of direct observations, and what is reality just exists. There is no kind of distinct possibility or possibility for any alternatives. They really don't think in those terms. Yeah, in theory. Okay, so now let's jump into some more specifics. Unlike adolescents, children tend to not wonder about how their personalities might change in the future or how they might have been different had they grown up under different circumstances. Adolescents are able to move easily between the specific and the abstract to generate alternative possibilities. The adolescent's ability to reason systematically in terms of what is possible is handy for learning math and science. Scientific experimentation requires ability to generate possibilities/hypotheses systematically. Adolescents can also use this newfound ability, or at least an enhanced ability, I should say, it's not completely new, to argue more effectively. So all of this is really getting at, as stated in the title, thinking about possibilities. What could you be in the future? Who knows? There are a lot of pathways you can go. And not only that, as stated, you can think about how your life may have been differently if you grew up in a different country, in a different class, if you're a different race, were you trans, like whatever. And that those kind of ability to imagine yourself in different circumstances allows you theoretically to kind of have increased understanding of yourself and of other people. Combined with kind of an ability to think about really specific things, concrete things that you can specifically observe, versus more abstract concepts, which we'll talk about later on in this lecture, but stuff like liberty, democracy, freedom. What do those things actually mean? Those are kind of abstract concepts that you really don't directly observe on a daily basis, but are kind of like ideologically based and again, kind of abstract. They're not immediately observable, and they also involve kind of, again, thinking about different possibilities. You think, okay, X form of democracy is the real democracy, democracy, I should say. So X form is the real form of democracy versus Y form of democracy. And it's not the real form of democracy because X, Y, Z. This is purely playing out kind of in your head, and you're working through abstract possibilities in a future that does not even exist. So that kind of ability increases with age. And again, we have this kind of systematic reasoning approach, which allows you to kind of generate possibilities, that is, hypotheses, and test them in a systematic way. So if you kind of ask a 5-year-old or something to complete some kind of task that's a little difficult for them, they'll often kind of just try different things or different methods in really a non-systematic way. They're just trying random things and really not exactly learning as much about what went wrong and what they can do to kind of improve to complete whatever task that's challenging in front of them, versus versus an adolescent who can try one thing and they can say, this didn't really work and this is why it didn't work, so let me try something else. And then they kind of work their way through whatever, completing a task in a scientific, structured way versus kind of like a random, haphazard way. And because of this, you can also use it to argue more because, again, you can imagine different possibilities, you can put yourself in different circumstances, and you can think through things, and again, in a more scientific, structured way, which all form possibilities of like debating and just arguing about life in general and being annoying. So what I was referring to more concretely is hypothetical thinking. That is if-then thinking. So if X happens, then Y happens. If I don't study for this class, then I will fail. If I don't have Netflix on while this lecture is happening, I will do better. Those kind of things like that. If I don't pay my rent, the landlord is going to come for you, because that happens in life. So again, X happens, therefore Y happens. And those things haven't happened yet. You're imagining them into the future. Adolescents are being able to plan ahead, or better at planning ahead, I should say, to see future consequences of an action, and to provide alternative explanations of events require being able to think hypothetically. They anticipate responses and plan ahead. Taking the perspective of others enables adolescents to think through what someone else might be thinking, which can help when formulating a viewpoint. If someone was a jerk to me, I'd be snippy too. So kind of, again, think about possibilities. You can theoretically take other people's perspectives. So I did something, I was acting like a jerk, or you can say, hey, if I'm acting like a jerk, then my friends will no longer like me. Or you can say, oh, I've seen my friend, someone's treating him or her like a jerk. I can see that my friend is now sad about that. Hey, if I had that happen to me, then I would be sad as well. So kind of, again, that actually didn't happen to you. You're imagining an event, that same event that happened to your friend, to happen to you. And that, again, increased perspectives, taking in, again, kind of combining with that if-then hypothetical thinking. And one way that they can anticipate responses is they can, adolescents are better able of, going to their parents and thinking through, okay, if I frame how I want to go out with my friends tonight correctly, or if I do a poor job explaining why I should go with my friends tonight, then my parents won't allow me to go out. So I have to think of a good explanation on why I should be allowed to go out tonight. Then my parents will say I'm allowed to go out. So again, kind of anticipating responses, thinking ahead, engaging in hypothetical thinkings to better prepare themselves from arguing or having an excuse to go out to, I don't know, some local mall and vaping or whatever. But not telling your parents that you're going to vape, or you will not be allowed to go. Thinking about abstract concepts. A second aspect of cognitive development is the appearance of a more systemic abstract thinking. Adolescents are able to think about interpersonal relationships, politics, philosophy, religion, and morality. They're able to think about abstract concepts such as friendship, faith, democracy, fairness, and honesty. They can ask themselves, what does liberty actually mean? Improvements in social thinking during adolescence are directly related to improvement in their ability to think abstractly. So kind of as I stated, and you can see how all these things kind of blend together a little bit. That's what always happens in psychology. Here, we're thinking in abstract terms. So again, things that aren't immediately kind of observable, but things that we can all think through. So what is democracy? What is fairness? What is honesty? Philosophical debates. All these things are kind of abstract concepts that are not directly observable. You're not working with democracy in your hands, unless this is ladies and gentlemen, unless this is a simulation and our alien overlords are doing so. But theoretically, in the absence of that, adolescents are thinking about these abstract concepts and, again, things that are not always directly observable. Sometimes, like voting, those kind of things. But still, even those kind of things exist within a broader kind of system that requires you to think about things in an abstract and systematic way. And then kind of this final bullet point about social thinking, we'll return to that momentarily, but which is kind of really the ability to kind of think through social relationships, social institutions in a more complex way. Thinking about thinking, this is typically referred to as metacognition, which is the process of thinking about thinking itself. So thinking about thinking. It involves monitoring one's own cognitive activity during thinking, being able to assess how well one is learning new material. You can make sure you understand a concept before moving forward. Increase introspection, thinking about our own emotions, and increase self-consciousness, thinking about how others think about us. So let's go through this, beginning with this monitoring aspect. So basically what thinking about thinking is, and there's actually a lot more to it here, but this is kind of like a basic understanding of it. Metacognition involves, so you can imagine yourself kind of reading your psychology textbook, which we all know you're all doing around the clock. So going through this beautiful textbook, and you're reading it, and you're like, I read this paragraph. Wait, I don't know what the hell I just read. Let me go ahead and reread this because I don't understand what the difference between these two constructs are. So let me reread it. So you're kind of thinking through, you're thinking about what it is that you learned. You're thinking about thinking. So you're able to better monitor and assess your kind of knowledge in real time and thus make adjustments. So this is kind of a knowledge almost like of your strengths, your weakness, your progression of learning in kind of real time. And this ability develops or further develops as you age. And then looking at this introspection point, we're really just kind of monitoring and evaluating what it is we're feeling and why it is we're feeling what we're feeling. So kind of an evaluation of our emotions, thinking about them. And then self-consciousness. So thinking about how others think about us. Spoiler, ladies and gentlemen, we are mammals. We live in a social world. At all times, we are either interacting with someone, listening to someone talking with us, or kind of reading the material that literally a human being wrote. So kind of the ability to have this self-consciousness, think about how other people think about us, and kind of use that to either make changes to ourselves, or maybe come to kind of some kind of coherent identity during adolescence is improved through this kind of increase in self-consciousness. Moving on, or continuing with thinking about thinking, adolescent egocentrism. The idea is that you unlock these new cognitive abilities / tools as you are maturing / still working through how to use them optimally. However, there's some cultural variation in some of these tools. Extreme self-absorption, argued by David Elkind, sometimes results in two types of problems for adolescents. Imaginary audience, that is the belief often brought on by a heightened self-consciousness of early adolescence that everyone is watching and evaluating one's behavior. Everyone is looking at me. Personal fable, adolescent belief that they are unique and therefore not subject to the rules that govern other people's behaviors. Dangerous when you believe, oh, I can do this because unlike others, me, the unique individual, can do this risky behavior and not be harmed. So again, let's walk this through, beginning with egocentrism. And basically the idea here is that, okay, now you can evaluate your own behavior at a higher level. You can evaluate how other people, or at least how you think other people feel about you. Doesn't necessarily mean it's reality-based. That can kind of contribute to a complete self-absorption because you're literally just like basing everything off yourself. The self is kind of like your reference points, and then you're comparing yourself to everyone else. So it's very me-focused. You're self-absorbed because you're constantly thinking about yourself and thinking about other people think about you, which again can lead to a complete self-absorption. You're stuck in your mind palace, imagining all these scenarios that are going on / may not be going on, but ultimately you are really like focused inward on yourself. And thus, you can really kind of see some cultural variation in kind of the extent of egocentrism, at least, and some other things. This is not tested on, but stuff like materialism, kind of like the extent to which you like have to buy things to like feel good as like an adolescent, which is like partially kind of reflecting like a focus on like yourself and the need to like consume to feel better and just whatever. It's very self-focused. So for example, again, this is like not tested on. There's like some studies in China that I've found that have found that kind of tight knit, positive, tight relationships with the family, kind of just positive social relationships, kind of decreasing the severity of this egocentrism in materialism, for that matter. Not with so they that can also I haven't seen I haven't gone through obviously every country or anything like that, but you can see here that there's some cultural variation and probably some kind of family protective factors, that is factors, environmental factors, social factors that kind of decrease the severity of egocentrism, and I would expect to see that across all cultures. But granted, whatever, U.S. kind of much more oriented towards kind of like a self approach in general, like historically, or I should say, kind of increasing actually through the years. Anyway, kind of moving on from that, this idea of this imaginary audience. So basically, this idea here is kind of straightforward. You're imagining that everybody's watching you. So because you now have this kind of self-consciousness, again, kind of thinking about yourself constantly, you're projecting that outward and basically saying, oh, everybody is focused on me. I'm in a crowd of 1 million people. I'm at a big concert. I'm at school. I'm at a pep rally, whatever. Everyone is looking at me because I'm only thinking about me. And then again, you're projecting that outward when in reality, probably the entire place, if this is like a bunch of 13-year-olds, they're all just kind of like hyper obsessed with the self. Again, with cultural variation here. And thus really not paying attention to each other at all, but everybody actually thinking everyone's looking at them. They're all Calvin Harris, everybody's looking at her kind of thing. Personal fable. This is the classic. My experiences are unique. Everything about me is kind of unique, especially, again, you can see cultural variation here. A classic kind of individualistic way of looking at the world, that all your experiences are super unique. No one's like you. Everybody's different. You can't tell me based on my life kind of lived experiences. Where in reality, hey, you're probably all attending high school. You're all kind of growing up, depending on the environment that you grow up in, the social and economic conditions, whatever. So you live in the suburbs. Everybody has some very tight range of income, or at least like a solid floor of like upper middle class. Okay, it ain't that real. Like you're all kind of within a kind of a similar range of social environments. Broadly speaking, of course, there are differences, obviously. But again, they take it to the extreme version of this is taking it to like everything about me is unique, aka RIP to your grandma, but I'm built differently. Like I can, hey, maybe some people get car crashes when they drink. Not me. I can handle this. So really kind of like an inflated sense of self-importance. And if you kind of go to TikTok comments, kind of a good example of this is like, have I never had an original experience? And it's like, no, you haven't. There's been literally billions of people who existed throughout time. Like, yes, there are some, broadly, again, kind of overgeneralizing a little bit here, but yes, you're not that unique. And adolescents can take that uniqueness to like an extreme, like kind of scale. Or I should say the belief that they're unique. Thinking about multiple dimensions, adolescents develop the ability to view things from more than one aspect at a time. They develop far more complicated self-conceptions and relationships. They imagine a really good basketball shooter, such as Steph Curry. In basketball, about to shoot the ball. But let's say he has a broken right arm. So therefore, it's going to be difficult to shoot the ball if you're playing basketball. The young child will think he is going to make the shot because he's a really good shooter. But in adolescence, will recognize that although the player is really good, other things, such as the fact that his arm is dangling from his shoulder and is broken, is going to massively reduce the likelihood that Steph Curry is going to hit the shot. Adolescents describe themselves and others in more complex ways. Why did the Mexican-American War begin? Or the U.S.-Mexican War. It's kind of now how scholarship describes it for a whole host of historical reasons, so we changed that slide in real time, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, also another example, I'm happy when I'm with my friends, but sad when I'm listening to my psychology lecture. The ability to look at things in multiple dimensions enables their adolescents' ability to understand and enjoy sarcasm/irony. Understanding what is being said is a combination of what is said and the context in which it is said. So going back to our kind of NBA player, basketball player, shooting a ball, who's a really good shooter, a young child is going to look at this player and they're going to say, oh, this dude's a good shooter. and he's going to make it every single time. And that young child is not necessarily going to factor in the fact that that good shooter now has a broken arm and physically cannot extend their arm to shoot the basketball to the same extent that an adolescent can. That is, they can take the contextual understanding of the event and factor that into the probability of an outcome. So yes, even though that person, that basketball player is a very good shooter, hey, we have to also consider the fact in this specific circumstance, this dude has a broken arm, and thus it is highly unlikely he's going to hit this shot and probably not even going to be able to play an NBA basketball game. Likewise, they can conceptualize historical events in more complex ways. So why did the U.S.-Mexican War begin? Well, and then they can just go through all kinds of different multiple dimensions, multiple reasons why this event happens. Any kind of behavior, any kind of event typically does not occur, never occurs for just one solo reason. There's always multiple reasons why that an event occurs, especially something, in this case, a war. Thus, they're able to, again, kind of take this increased social context, take multiple kind of perspectives, and then thus kind of come to a fuller understanding of why events occur. And kind of relatedly, they understand that in some social contexts, I can be happy, I can be rambunctious adolescents, but in my psychology lecture course, I have to listen to this full talk about the U.S.-Mexican War. I have to sit here quietly. I have to not distract myself theoretically. And thus I am not happy. So again, understanding that they're different in different social circumstances. And relatedly, that ability to understand sarcasm and irony, because the meaning of our social language depends on not just what is said, but the context. So imagine you're listening, you have one of your peers, one of your classmates over, and you're both listening to my lecture right now, and you're like, oh, can this dude move on to you're thinking in your head, can this dude just move on to the next slide? I'm tired of this shit. But what you say out loud to your friend who is also with you, and also maybe thinking that exact same thing, you say, wow, this is so interesting. You both understand in that moment, hey, this lecture actually isn't interesting, but you're being sarcastic. You understand the kind of a larger social context in which you're saying that thing, and thus, although you're saying this lecture is very interesting, you both understand that you are being sarcastic and ironic, which kind of allows an adolescent to understand more complex humor than like the roadrunner and the coyote chasing each other and then just falling off a cliff over and over again, which can be fun, but again, not as complex as sarcasm and irony. And finally, our last component here is adolescent relativism. Adolescents shift from seeing things as absolute to seeing things as relative. Compared to younger children, adolescents are more likely to question others' assertions and less likely to accept quote-unquote facts as absolute truths. Difficulties can arise when adolescents begin to see parents' values as relative. Don't have sex, don't smoke weed in college. So kind of the idea here, again, kind of going back to this, imagining hypotheticals, imagining a different world, imagining counterfactuals, working through if-then thinking, working through abstract thought. These all allow you to look at the world in more kind of relative terms. Not just as, okay, this is the world, these are the facts, that's the way it is, and that's it. Boom. Okay, well, I agree, the end. Well, now it's like, what if, let's think this through a little bit kind of thing here. You start to see these quote-unquote facts as not necessarily universal truths that have to exist no matter what. So some kind of common difficulties arise when, parents say like, don't have premarital sex or something along those lines. And again, you can kind of see here how these are also historically based and wrapped up in all kinds of other kind of common social norms within the given culture. So for whatever, as stated, don't have sex before premarital marriage, as like the law of the land or whatever, maybe probably, and typically, not always, but kind of religiously based or something along those lines. And then an adolescent being like, I don't really think that's kind of like this universal truth. I think we're going to be all right. And same kind of thing with smoking weed, like kind of a classic, like 30 years ago, kind of a reefer madness kind of idea. Like, if you smoke any weed, you're going to become a deviant, you're going to jail, and all those kind of things. And even this isn't even in college. Hey, middle schoolers who are definitely not watching this anyway, don't smoke weed. Middle schoolers, knock it off. Anyway, so in college, though, it's like, at that point, the adolescent can be like, well, I'm an adult. I'm also like doing pretty well in school. It's gonna be all right. I'm gonna hit this real quick. So again, you now have you're moving from like absolute truth to like, sometimes it's okay. This is not an absolute universal rule that you have to follow no matter what. Things change. There are different theoretical perspectives on how these cognitive advances are achieved and the processes underlying them. So in everything you see in this class, and all psychology classes, all social sciences, there's competing theories. It's not like, oh, all psychologists agree with this. There are different schools of thought with different kind of arguments, different kind of aspects of these processes that they focus on, and thus come to different conclusions. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few of them. So let's talk about this momentarily. Debate on the processes underlying improvements in adolescents' thought processes. Different researchers measure adolescent thinking in different ways. There are two classic theories, and we'll cover another one actually. Piaget's theory and information processing. So kind of the idea again, so you have different schools of thought, you have different conclusions, and not just different conclusions, but different variables that researchers are looking at based on their particular schools of thoughts. Because they feel that those variables are kind of like key to the processes underlying advancement in kind of adolescent cognition. Beginning with Piaget, who really had like a lock on developmental psychology for a very long time. If you have like professors older than 50 who are like psychologists, 55, super influenced by like Piaget. He dominated the field for a long time. And we'll get to it momentarily, but not so much now. A lot of things were found not to be supported. But here is his theory. And this is always taught. We're kind of like stuck in this like the old kind of school thinking of like, we really got to teach Piaget because he's super influential, even though we know that most of it or a lot of things are not supported, but it's how it is. So, what can you do? We're all constrained. Anyway, moving on for Piaget. Abstract system of logical reasoning. Piaget argued that the chief feature that differentiates adolescent thinking from that of children is logical reasoning. In order to think about alternatives in multidimensional ways, well said, you need a system of thinking that works in real life and in hypothetical situations. Competence and performance. It's important to differentiate between what can be done and what people actually do in their daily lives. Everyday decision making is marred by many errors in logic. If you ask a person if they want a 1 in 10 chance to win something or a 10 in a 100 chance to win something, most U.S. Americans pick the latter, even if the odds are exactly the same. So for Piaget, basically what he's arguing is that you need a kind of cognitive system to engage in these abstract thoughts, multidimensional ways of thinking. You need a cognitive system that allows you to think in hypothetical situations in abstract ways, and at the same time having a cognitive system that allows you to like operate in the real world. So you have to be able to think in abstract ways and then also kind of use your new cognitive abilities to make decisions, behave in particular ways. Again, you can engage in that if-then thinking, trying to convince your parents to go to the mall with you. So again, this kind of logical reasoning increases the ability to think hypothetically and operate in the real world. But as everybody kind of understands, there's a difference between what can theoretically be done and people's kind of like theoretical reasoning ability and actually what they do. People make unreasonable, non-logical decisions all the time. And kind of this little example here that even though 1 in 10 and 10 in 100 are exactly the same percentages, 10%, most U.S. Americans will pick the latter, maybe because it's just a larger number or something along those lines, I would just guess. So even though there's really no difference and you have this theoretical competence, it doesn't mean you're actually performing better at all times or always making logical decisions. It kind of doesn't operate that way. Moving on to some critiques of Piaget. The Piagetian view is not as influential as it used to be. It was super popular for decades. So as I stated, super dominated the field. And then a lot of things came out where it was like, I don't know about that Piaget. So not really. But despite that, again, every developmental textbook, this one not as much though. If you take like Lifespan Developmental Psychology textbook, it's like 2-3 pages of Piaget. It's crazy. It's always the largest theory. And then always at the end, it's like, then there's always like a paragraph where it's like, actually, most of this is not really well-founded. So always happens. I get, we're kind of like in a transition stage, I guess, in history. I don't know. Anyway, little research supports the following ideas: that cognitive development proceeds in a stage-like fashion. Stages mean that as you age, you reach new stages and unlock new abilities that are only accessible at that stage. There is a uniquely adolescent stage of thinking. Rather, advanced reasoning capabilities develop gradually, continuously, in a steady fashion. So basically, Piaget had a set of stages, and basically you can conceptualize stages as like steps on a set of stairs. And at each stair, as you take a step at each stair, you kind of unlock new abilities. So boom, I'm on whatever. I'm stair 1. I have a set number of abilities. Now I take a step. I'm on stair 2. Boom, I have a whole new set of abilities that did not exist prior to step number 2. So at each step, you unlock new abilities that previously did not exist. And basically, Piaget named those steps/stages that there's like 4 stages, but aka 4 steps. But even in there, those 4 stages, there's like all kinds of like sub kind of stages, but whatever, it doesn't matter. And the thing is, that kind of theory, not really well supported. Instead, what more modern developmental psychologists have found is that rather than that, again, that step process where you unlock a whole new ability at each step, instead it's kind of like a slope, and you're slowly growing continuously in a gradual, steady function. Now, some abilities are growing at quicker rates than others, but again, it's not that you just unlock a whole new ability that you could not access at prior to that step, prior to reaching whatever step 2. And not only that, but many cross-cultural studies, I should say, have found that people can learn things. So again, we have 4 stages. Like a 4-year-old, 5-year-old can learn things that are traditionally associated with like step 3, stage 3, which is thought to not be even be possible until you're like around adolescence. So there's a lot of cultural variation, and it's, again, not super supported, and thus why I'm not asking you to memorize them, because I don't know why I would do that, because it's not, this is not consensus anymore, so, and it's really not supported, so we are not doing that. Moving on to this information processing view, it's a perspective on cognition that derives from the study of artificial intelligence and attempts to explain cognitive development in terms of specific components of the thinking process. Researchers focus on 4 areas in which improvement occurs during adolescence. That is attention, memory, processing speed, and organization. So while Piaget kind of tried to just kind of describe these kind of cognitive advancements at each stage, this here is really trying to say, okay, these are your 4 specific abilities that you prove as an adolescent, and we're going to test those specific abilities and determine if adolescents do improve on attention, memory, processing speed, and organization. So again, it's really kind of a focus on improving on those 4 specific areas that they have identified in this theory. We're going to look at 2 types here: selective attention, the process by which we focus on one thing while tuning out another. So we're selecting what we choose to focus on. So for example, ignoring your roommate blasting TikToks as you listen to this exciting lecture. You're choosing and focusing on this beautiful, exciting lecture while ignoring your friends, your roommate's cursed FYP page. Divided attention, the process of paying attention to 2 or more different things at the same time. So you're watching your roommate's TikToks as you listen to this exciting lecture at the same time. Adolescents improve in both of these types of attention. The ability to inhibit an unwanted response also improves during early and middle adolescence. Ignore your phone vibrating as you are listening to this exciting lecture. This is likely linked to maturations of brain systems that govern impulse control. So kind of we have those 2 forms of attention. Again, hearing basically 2 audio stimuli at the same time. Your roommate's cursed FYP page, and this beautiful, exciting lecture. And then if you're using selective attention, you are choosing, hopefully, you're selecting to listen to this exciting lecture and ignoring your friend's roommate's cursed FYP page. Versus, again, divided attention, both stimuli occurring at the same time. And then instead of selecting only one to listen to, you say, you know what, I'm going to listen to both at the same time. Thus, you are dividing your attention between 2 audio stimuli. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be audio, but it's 2 stimuli. Also, we have this kind of inhibition kind of theoretical advancement, aka your phone is like vibrating, the group chat is popping off, and your phone is vibrating, but at the same time, you're like, you know what? I need to pass this psychology quiz. So I'm going to ignore that vibration on my phone until after this lecture, or at least until the slide is over, and then I'll hit the pause button. That, and again, that's still kind of like an increase of inhibition, thought to be related to maybe increases in impulse control or neurological systems related to impulse control. Memory is also improved during adolescence. Working memory is information held for a relative short period of time, about 30 seconds. It actually really depends on the specific type of working memory, and there's a debate. It really doesn't matter for the purpose of this class. Good enough, 30 seconds. Some people, again, have flows like 10, 5, whatever. Doesn't matter. It's short. While a problem is being solved. Long-term memory, ability to recall something from a long time ago. Autobiographical memory, it's a recall of personally meaningful events. This ability emerges when you're around 2.5, 3 years old. Reminiscence bump, the fact that experiences from adolescence are generally recalled more than experiences from other stages of life. It might be related to increased emotional salience during adolescence, making us more likely to remember mundane things. So again, kind of working memory is kind of that short, again, very brief memory. So you can really think about one kind of example of this is working through a math problem. So kind of like doing long division in your head, for example, like, oh, I got to carry the 1 and blah, blah, blah. So you have information that you're working with directly in your head for a short period of time to solve some kind of problem or task. Versus long-term memory, which is theoretically like infinite. And can then last for decades. You know, you can be 100 years old and be like, oh, I remember when I was like, whatever, 10, and then this happened to me. So theoretically, like infinite, and theoretically can last a very, very long time. Autobiographical memory, the recalling personally meaningful events. And this kind of involves like an ability to have kind of like a coherent narrative of your life. Like we all create narratives in our life, even if they're fake, real, whatever. We all do it. And to kind of, again, give us meaning as we kind of march through time, kind of having almost like a coherent self, which there's kind of cultural variation on, but like a narrative that allows us to present who we are, where we came from, and maybe where we're going into the future. However, this memory does really not emerge until around 3 years old. So you cannot, let me be clear, cannot remember things from when you're 1 year old. I hate to burst this bubble. Throughout this class, I often reveal things in pop psychology that are not real. No, you're not remembering things before you're 2.5 years old. Like explicitly, you're not remembering it. Maybe on like some kind of unconscious level, may affect something, I don't know, whatever. But you are not explicitly remembering these things. Like you can take it all the way to extreme, or some highly questionable people who are, this is not valid, no scientific support for, will say like, oh, I remember when I was a fetus, and now I'm 20 years old, and that fetus experiences that I definitely remember is affecting me right now. And it's like, no, it's not. You're just kind of making up a memory, which is possible. You can literally just make up memories. Memories are not this thing you just download into your head, and then it's just there for life. Memories are kind of constantly reconstructed, and thus subject to kind of accidentally forgetting things and kind of changing the narrative a little bit, which you'll notice throughout your life. And then we have this reminiscent bump, and kind of the idea here is what we're getting at is, why do we seem to remember, in general, more things from adolescent than other stages in life? Even though like a lot of adolescent stuff is kind of like not that consequential. Like you're not getting married at like 10 years old. In general, you're not having a child. So it's like, okay, well, why do I remember this stupid mundane thing, this little social interaction that really has no meaningful impact on my life? Well, kind of some proposed reasons is that maybe that adolescents have heightened emotional salience. So kind of the idea here is that even the most mundane things that typically as an adult, as a 50-year-old, you're like, I don't care, I'm going to move on with my life. It ain't that real. I don't care about the social interaction. Who cares? At like 10 years old or whatever, 13 years old, having that higher emotional salience, aka we have stronger emotional responses to kind of mundane events at this age, theoretically, than to other ages. So it's not necessarily that we're experiencing more emotional events, larger events, but really kind of our evaluation of those events may be differently. So a kind of like heightened sensitivity. Speed. Adolescents gain the ability to process the information needed to solve problems faster. The biggest increase in speed occurs in early adolescence. Difference in speed between a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old is greater than that between a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. Organization. Adolescents improve in their ability to use organizational strategies when approaching problems. They approach things with a more thorough plan and are able to adapt at higher levels. As you continue to study/learn, you learn how to learn. This makes learning opportunities more efficient and effective for adolescents compared to younger children. So kind of beginning up at the top here with the speed. Big advances in speed occurs throughout adolescence, so aka the ability and the quickness in which you can solve problems increases rapidly. But however, there's kind of periods during adolescence where your ability of speed really makes a rapid jump. To such an extent that the difference, again, between 9 and 12 years olds and their kind of cognitive speed in solving problems, so how quick, whatever, they can solve some math problems or something along those lines, or whatever, any other problem, is larger than that between a 12 and a 15-year-old. So that is the gap in ability, in this case speed, so the gap in speed between the 9 and 12-year-old is greater, which tells you that there's a huge jump between 9 and 12, than the speed between a 12-year-old and 15-year-old. AKA, yes, at 15-year-olds, you do get a little faster, but the kind of, the degree of that jump in ability in speed is less compared to that jump between 9 and 12. So that 9 and 12 jump is larger than that jump in speed between 12 and 15. And then this organization thing kind of is going back really to kind of that scientific way of approaching thinking and even metacognition a little bit. So you understand how you learn more, you understand how just people learn in general, like not blasting TikToks as you're trying to learn. Spoiler, that's not just a uniquely for me kind of situation, but rather like for we. Okay, and I have not tweeted that out yet, but I want that trademarked, for we. So keep that in mind. If you use that, you need to credit me. Anyway, so kind of you understand that, yes, there are specific better ways to study, more efficient, more effective ways to learn, and thus you can use those and then also make plans to study in a more coherent way and just kind of approach life with a more thorough, structural, scientific, plan-oriented way than kind of just being kind of like random and a little spazzy or way. Is cognitive development complete by age 15? By age 15, adolescents are as proficient as adults in basic cognitive abilities, such as working memory and attention. They are still developing sophisticated cognitive skills such as thinking creatively, planning ahead in more complex ways, and judging costs and benefits and risks. The development of advanced abilities is a longer developmental process. So kind of the idea here is that around 15 years old, you kind of have this basic, almost equal, or basically equal skills of working memory and attention as a 40-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 50-year-old, whatever. So you have equal skills in working memory and attention. However, kind of more complex thinking ahead, such as judging risk and reward and thinking creatively, continues to develop past 15 years of age. The adolescent brain. So in the last 25 years, due to massive advancements in neural technology, adolescent brain development research has improved dramatically. Experts study brain maturation using imaging techniques. The first, functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, is a technique used to produce images of the brain, often while the subject is performing some sort of mental task. Diffusion tension imaging, DTI, is a technique used to produce images of the brain that shows connections among different regions. And basically what fMRI does is measure kind of oxygen, blood oxygen levels in your brain. So basically while certain parts of your brain are active, so increased activity is going on in certain areas of your brain, in order for that increased activity to occur on a neurological level, the brain requires elevated levels of blood oxygen. So basically what the fMRI machine is doing is measuring the levels of blood oxygen within a given, you can do it in an entire brain or kind of even really just focus on one specific aspect of your brain. So basically what you can do is have adolescents complete some, I'll just say something, so complete some kind of a mathematic quiz while they're sitting inside an fMRI machine, and then measure kind of their neurological activity. That is, specifically in an fMRI machine, again, measure what areas of the brain increase in blood oxygen thus kind of giving you an indirect measure of increased neurological activities. And then not only that, then you can have like a 50-year-old come into your research lab and take the same math test inside an fMRI machine, measure their blood oxygen levels in the same brain regions or across the whole brain, and say, okay, what parts of the brain between the adolescents and the 50-year-old adult, what areas of the brain are more active or less active while completing this math problem. So you basically can compare kind of brain activity through this blood oxygen levels, and then that tells you a little bit about what advances are made on a neurological level as you develop through adolescence. And DTI is kind of a measurement of connections in different parts of the brain. This is actually, you may have heard of as white matter. They're measuring basically how connected specific areas of the brain are, which is basically telling you, or I should say, it's kind of like an indirect measurement of kind of your brain's efficiency, and kind of like it's a way to measure how developed certain parts of the brain are, because basically as you develop and age, you develop more white matter, which is basically related to kind of increased function and kind of increased speed, neurologically speaking. So again, in a DTI machine, you can have a 10-year-old perform some kind of task in a DTI machine, and a 50-year-old or whatever, a 15-year-old, and then look at their white matter differences and say, oh, the 15-year-old has more white matter in the prefrontal cortex. Therefore, that's got to be implicated in whatever, in something along those lines. So again, kind of comparing connections between people, which gives us insight into kind of changes, specific neurological changes throughout adolescence and development across the lifespan. So brain development can be measured in different ways. The first, brain structure, which is the physical form and organization of the brain. Different ages have different size parts of their brain. Brain function, patterns of brain activity. Different ages use different parts of the brain to achieve the same task. Scientists also study age differences in patterns of brain activity, such as EEG, a technique for measuring electrical activity at different locations on the scalp, and ERP, changes in electrical activity in areas of the brain in response to specific stimuli or events. So we have two different ways of evaluating the brain. That is structure. So this is kind of just like classic, well, I don't know if it's classic, but different kind of like size brains. As you grow older, your brain gets larger, which is going to have kind of consequences on your ways of thinking and kind of behavioral outcomes. And versus brain functioning. So basically, although you can basically have a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old and a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 30-year-old do the same thing, complete the same task, and even though they're doing the exact same behavior, completing the same exact task, they'll have different patterns of brain activity, which kind of suggests that as you grow older, different parts of the brain become a little more specialized, or not even just that, but different kind of elaborate neurological systems develop that allow for increased efficiency and proficiency in a given task. And then finally, we have this kind of EEG kind of thing. And the idea here is that it's just EEG is just basically a global umbrella term for a technique of measuring electrical activity in the brain. Your brain is producing kind of electricity at all times. That is how your neurons function. And event-related potentials, ERPs, are kind of you can think of it as specific changes in response to completing a task. So again, like you complete a mathematical task, and whatever, your brain activity, the EEG machine picks up increased brain activity, increased electrical activity in your prefrontal cortex. The quick spike, that is the event-related potential. It's the changes in the electrical activity in response to a particular event, a stimuli, in this case, a mathematical test. So boom, that big spike. That spike is the event-related potential, so the specific event. Differences between male and female brains. The differences in structure and function are very small and unlikely to explain differences between males and females in the way they behave or think. Male brains are about 10% larger than female brains. However, there's no/very little relationship between overall brain size and intellectual functioning as adults. Some parts of the brain slightly are larger in males, some parts are slightly larger in females. However, the difference is probably actually not meaningful. You can basically have little small differences, statistically speaking, in areas of the brain, or literally anything. But in reality, behaviorally, it actually has it doesn't manifest in any actual differences, aka practical significance. So it's just because something is statistically different doesn't mean it has a practical difference. So kind of a classic example of this is, say, males, I'm just making up something, are on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the most extroverted. Say males are 9 extroverted and females are 9.1 extroverted. Okay, yes, there's a significant difference between those on a statistical level, but what is the meaningful difference in the real world? What is the practical significance of being 9 on an extroversion scale versus 9.1? Probably effectively 0. It's not a meaningful difference, even though it's a statistical difference. Similarities are more striking than differences. Many scholars argue that what differences emerge are socially based, and it's typically not actually a useful predictor. There's no neurological evidence to justify gender-based curriculum or teaching practices. So kind of typically the differences that do emerge are very much based on kind of like social norms and expectations, gender roles, those kind of things that contribute to different males or boys and girls kind of being exposed to kind of different stimuli and events throughout their life, which may contribute to kind of slight differences. But again, those are socially based. if you know, classically, historically, you can take this through kind of a historical period. If women are excluded from academia, and that means that they're going to be funneled into kind of jobs and skill sets that contribute to higher development in particular ways of thinking. So whatever, say women are like systematically excluded from mathematics, which happened, literally. Therefore, kind of areas associated in the brain, kind of systems and areas of the brain associated with kind of mathematical thinking are going to be kind of less pronounced than males, because they have more practice doing so. So again, just that kind of practice effect, which is kind of historically rooted and kind of systematic exclusion, contributing to those differences. So again, kind of socially based. Now, how your brain actually works. The brain functions by sending electrical signals across circuits of interconnected cells. Neurons, nerve cells. Neurons are nerve cells, and they're about 100 billion, aka a number that is just meaningless to the human mind. It doesn't mean anything. It's too large. If you look at connections between neurons, it's in the, like, I forgot what the number is, but like 100 trillion. It's absurd. It's a meaningless number that just speaks to the complexity of the human brain. The kind of three main parts of the brain, or a neuron, I should say, the three main parts of a neuron that are traditionally taught are the cell body, which is referred to the soma. This is the center of the cell. It builds new and renew cell components. This is where the nucleus of the neuron is located. The dendrites are branch-like extensions that receive electrical information from other neurons. They are like receivers on phones. They listen in to other neurons and pass on information to other cells. We have axons, which are tails of the neurons that spread out from the cell body and transmit electrical information. They can be several feet long. They're like phone transmitters. They send messages to other neurons. So these neurons are communicating electrically. And what's going on here is, again, we have that cell body, the middle of the cell, where the nucleus is. Kind of above that are the dendrites, which again are kind of like branches that extend. And the branches, the dendrites, are designed to receive electrical information from neighboring neurons. So it's one neuron is sending an electrical signal to you, and then a neighboring neuron will pick it up through their dendrites. They're like a cell phone receiver. They're receiving information. Versus axons, so basically what happens is that electrical impulses are kind of transmitted from the cell body, the soma, to the axon, so travel down the axon, aka the tail. You can see it's kind of just like a tail. And this is kind of like a phone transmitter, aka they send message to other neurons. So one neuron will have electrical impulse, electrical activity. It'll travel down the tail, the axon, and then get kind of to the end of the axon, and then there will be very close to another neighboring neuron, and that neighboring neuron's dendrites will receive that electrical information, and along we go. So one neuron having electrical activity at kind of like their phone transmitter, aka again like sending out electrical signals, and then a neighboring neuron, a neighboring dendrites pick up those signals, and along we go. We have something called synapses, the gap in space between neurons across which neurotransmitters carry electrical impulses, and there is our number. There are about 160 trillion connections between neurons. Neurotransmitters, brains also communicate chemically. Specialized chemicals that trigger the release of electrical impulses between neurons. So, as I said before, the brain communicates electrically. So, again, kind of receiving electrical information from the dendrites, and then sending out electrical information through the axon. And between those neighboring neurons, is kind of this little gap you'll see. This really small, like almost like a vacuum. You can think like a space, like being in outer space, like a little vacuum that exists between neighboring neurons, and that again is called the synapse. And what happens is that dendrites release. After receiving an electrical signal, will release neurotransmitters. So again, kind of specialized chemicals. Classic ones include like dopamine, for example, serotonin, but there are many others. And what happens is, again, a dendrite receives this electrical signal, and then the neurotransmitter is released into that vacuum space, which is kind of separates the neurons from each other. And then the neighboring neurons, dendrites, will kind of like receive the neurotransmitters of the neighboring axon. So we have, again, so imagine soma having like an electrical signal, boom, it happens. It's that electrical signal is now traveling down the axon, that tail, okay? You get to the end of that tail, boom, neurotransmitters are released. They're now floating in that vacuum. And what a neighboring neuron will do is say, oh, my dendrites are now going to welcome those neurotransmitters into myself, and now the presence, that entrance of neurotransmitters into that new neuron will then start the electrical chain again. So you have basically electrical chain inside the neuron, which contributes to the release of neurotransmitters, aka specific chemicals, that then trigger electrical activity in neighboring neurons. And away we go. So a combination of electrical signals and chemicals, specifically neurotransmitters. Pruning, the process through which unnecessary connections between neurons are eliminated, improving the efficiency of information processing. The process begins soon after birth. It makes the brain more efficient, consisting of the death of neurons, remove all connections that aren't useful. During pruning, as many as 70% of all neurons die off. The process is helpful because it streamlines neural organization, enhances communication. The brain is molded and shaped by the environment, like trimming a rosebud to make a healthier plant. So kind of classically in pop culture, we think, oh, the more neurons, the more of anything, the better. The bigger the brain, the better. All those kind of things. But this is not true. A big aspect of brain development is efficiency. And that involves this idea of pruning. So literally the death of neurons. So as many as 70% of the neurons that you start off with die. And what's basically going on is that your brain it's kind of a use it or lose it situation. So your environment and your behaviors are impacting and influencing which neurons die out. It thus kind of structuring your brain to kind of meet the demands of your environment. So it's kind of like that plasticity again. In this case here, though, it's the environment impacting which neurons die out, and over time, that is thought to kind of like streamline the process and make your brain more efficient. So again, more is not better, neurologically speaking, and we're looking at what you want is efficiency and speed. Again, you also you have to have some amount, obviously, the number matters, but it's not the more forever, the better. Myelination. White matter provides support and protection for neurons and includes a fatty substance called myelin, well said, that surrounds the axons of certain neurons. Myelination, the process through which the brain circuits are insulated with myelin. which improves the efficiency of information processing. It occurs throughout adulthood, different brain regions at different rates. So one way the brain also becomes more efficient is through this myelination process. And this is what white matter is. It's basically like blankets kind of around the axon of your neuron. If you go back to the previous neuron slide, you can see those kind of like blankets. And what basically is happening is those blankets again, provide insulation, and it allows for an increase in speed of neuron communication, because the electrical signal basically is able to jump from those little gaps. So you'll see like a blanket on the axon, then a gap where there is no myelin, and then again another blanket. And basically the signal is able to jump between those little gaps, which allows for increased speed and efficiency in communication between the neurons, thus kind of a quicker, more efficient information processing. So again, speed, efficiency, much more predictive of performance than kind of just like overall brain size or something along those lines. The age of opportunity. Some areas of the brain may be especially malleable or plastic in adolescence. Plasticity refers to the capacity of the brain to change in response to experience. Again, the brain is shaped/molded by the environment. This is a form of adaptation. The brain's malleability in response to experience enables us to learn and strengthen abilities. It uses a use it or lose it approach. There's evidence that the increase in brain plasticity in adolescence is influenced by the hormonal changes of puberty. Plasticity is more easily and reliably accomplished before adulthood. So as I've said multiple times throughout this class, the brain is plastic. Again, you can imagine hot plastic and you can mold it. And what's molding it is the environment, or one big aspect of what's molding it is the environment. So your brain literally being adapted to the environment that you grow up in. And this is kind of a form of adaptations. One aspect of humanity, and one reason why like humans take so long to develop compared to like a giraffe. Like a giraffe is born and then they're able to like run around, move around a little bit, versus like a human who they ain't doing anything for like months, years. Is that kind of a elongated period of plasticity, wherein again the environment is super shaping our brain and allowing us to adapt to the environment around us. So it's basically our brain saying, oh, the environment's like this, so therefore I should structure the brain like this. So again, this is all occurring at a like biological, biochemical level, but that's kind of the process here. And the idea here again, use it or lose it. So theoretically though, you can see how this is dangerous. Not dangerous, but some consequences can emerge. So imagine growing up in an environment where there is little learning opportunities, no books at the house, maybe an unstable neighborhood, an unstable family, living in poverty, living in a war zone, whatever, growing up in an economic depression. All these things occurring can impact a adolescent's brain development, because maybe they have less opportunities to read, less opportunities to socialize, but more opportunities to engage in deviant behavior. All those kind of things, again, going back to the historical era you live in, and these larger macro things, all can influence your brain development. And this is where kind of culture comes along as well, influencing kind of your brain development. We have two types of plasticity we're going to look at here. Developmental plasticity, which is extensive remodeling of the brain's circuitry in response to experiences during childhood and adolescence while the brain is still maturing. It's much more drastic changes and can be described as a sensitive period. Adult plasticity, comparatively minor changes in brain circuits as a result of experiences during adulthood, after the brain has matured. By definition, to learn or remember, you must biologically be capable of change. Typically, it's more minor, requires more effort, learning how to read versus reading a new book. Language, for example, definitely possible, but more challenging. More strongly affected by drugs. Trauma, possibly more harmful. This is why drug use during adolescence has more lasting effects. So kind of the idea here is for developmental plasticity is that, again, during certain time periods of your life, you see very rapid changes in growth and remodeling on a neurological level at certain stages in life. This can be thought of as a sensitive period. So basically the idea here is your brain is very, very sensitive to the environment around you. It's super plastic during that moment. It's very open to being molded to a very large extent during kind of specific sensitive periods. And adolescence may be a sensitive period. There are other sensitive periods that exist throughout life, but we're obviously just an adolescent class. versus kind of as adult plasticity, where yes, your brain is still changing. In fact, you may actually be able to develop new neurons, new research suggests, but it's kind of to a relatively less extent. So for example, it's much harder to learn how to read as an adult versus like reading a new book. Or you can also see this with learning a foreign language. It's much more harder to learn a foreign language when you're 30 versus when you're 5. Because theoretically, your brain is much more plastic, much more plastic at 5 years old. So that's not saying that it's impossible to do so, but again, much more challenging. But again, as stated, your brain is always a little bit plastic because by definition, if you're learning something, your brain is constantly always changing, but not to the same extent as to during those very sensitive periods. Which may be one reason why drug use, for example, is much more dangerous during early adolescence because your brain is still undergoing very, very rapid changes. It's a much more sensitive period versus maybe in adulthood where your brain's, again, changes do occur throughout lifespan, but on a relatively lesser scale, thus maybe placing you less at risk on a neurological level. So kind of two areas of the brain that go through changes in adolescence. There are others, but these are kind of like two classic ones. The prefrontal cortex, which is the region of the brain most important for sophisticated thinking abilities such as planning, thinking ahead, weighing risk and rewards, and controlling impulses. And the limbic system, an area of the brain that plays an important role in the processing of emotional experiences, social information, and reward and punishment. Kind of a popular one is the amygdala, but there are other ones. So we kind of have this two thinking, kind of like rational planning thinking, weighing risks and rewards, and then another kind of like processing social information and emotional experiences. There's considerable variability, aka differences, among adolescents of the same chronological age in the time and extent and brain maturations. Attempts to measure this by creating a metric that measures synaptic pruning and myelination for an overall brain development score. This is likely due to both genetic and environmental influences. For example, one study showed that individuals high in prosocial behavior had greater and faster thinning of the cortex during the transition from early to mid-adolescence. This kind of thinning process is associated with psychological maturation. So kind of a couple points here is that even though you're the exact same age, you can be at different levels of kind of like brain maturation and brain development, which again can kind of combine some kind of genetic situation, but also environmental influences. So as stated here, in households and neighborhoods, maybe even you can take this to a country, a culture-wide, the kind of thing that engage in more pro-social behavior, that is like doing things, engaging in behavior to help other people kind of thing. Like altruism, empathy, those kind of things, go through this kind of cortex development at a quicker rate than adolescents in environments with less pro-social behavior. So again, you can see here, even these kind of like behaviors, these customs, influencing the development, the maturation sequence of adolescence. No, that doesn't necessarily mean that people in non-pro-social areas are never going to reach that. It could be more challenging, but you can see even the environment impacting these universal biological processes. Two of the most important changes in brain function involve the prefrontal cortex. Patterns of activation within the PFC generally become more focused. Adolescents improve in two areas: response inhibition, the suppression of behavior that is inappropriate and no longer required. Can test, I should say, by telling participants to push a button when a specific image appears, but to not press a button when other images appear. Adolescents are less likely to activate parts of the brain that are not associated with task performance, again, become more efficient. So kind of the idea here is inhibition. So you can, a response inhibition, I should say. So this is basically the inhibiting responses to something. And one way, as I stated, to test this is that you can literally just have a one button. You can put an adolescent in front of a computer screen and say, okay, every time a red arrow pops up on the screen, press a button. If it's a green arrow, don't press the button. But you do it really, really fast. So you're basically testing if they can inhibit their kind of willingness to press that button. Now, interestingly, even you can have other different age groups kind of complete that button inhibition task, and different age groups will activate different parts of their brain when completing that task. And adolescents, kind of, or the younger you are in adolescence, they are more likely to activate more parts of their brain in response to completing that task. So they're actually using more of their brain to complete a task than maybe like a 30-year-old. So which again is demonstrating that that adolescents are relying on basically all these things that are really not involved with that inhibition task, because they're still kind of working through on a neurological level, kind of proper efficiency, pruning, those kind of things, and thus are kind of bringing in irrelevant parts of the brain to complete a task, globally stated, broadly stated. Versus as you get a little older, you become a little more efficient, and basically specific parts of the brain and specific systems of the brain become more specialized and are used to complete a particular task. So they become more efficient, and again, less activity, which is kind of typically counterintuitive. And then executive function, more advanced thinking skills enabled chiefly by the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, especially in early adolescence. So this is things like delay of gratification. You may have seen like the marshmallow task, those kind of things, and stuff like working memory. But really it's also conceptualized as like an executive overseeing like emotions and your thinking. So kind of have like consciousness basically is how we think about humanity. Is one aspect of that is like executive function. Again, like monitoring, more advanced thinking styles, inhibition, delay of gratification, all those good things. Another big jump in the PFC is functional connectivity. This is the extent to which multiple brain regions function at the same time. That is, the brain regions work as a team. So as you get older, and I should say younger children tend to really have their neurological activity is very kind of localized, almost like discrete units of parts of the brain working almost kind of independently. Again, broadly stated, not exactly true. But as you get older, you form more complex systems, complex neurological systems, and are able to perform more complex tasks. Because think about it, when you do a hard, complex task, you're using a lot of different skills, and thus you kind of need to kind of incorporate very, very complex neurological systems. And you basically see big jumps in this functional connectivity, the complexity of brain regions coming together to perform a task, all the way up to 22 years of age. Some estimates have it higher though. Moving on, the social brain. Most mammals become more social around the time of puberty, theorized because of sexual maturation. In adolescent adults, or humans I should say, changes to brain regions called the quote-unquote social brain bring new perceptions and behaviors. Adolescents are more sensitive to facial expressions and social cues. So being yelled at by a parent, an adolescent may be more likely to pay attention to the act of yelling rather than the content of the message. This affects reduce if criticism is accompanied by warmth. There's increased sensitivity to social evaluation. Adolescents can ignore feedback if adolescents feel their advice as feedback is interfering with their goals. Attentiveness to others' mental states can help develop empathy/social skills. They're more susceptible, theoretically, to peer pressure. However, that sensitivity isn't, there's variance, I should say, in that sensitivity. So basically the idea here is that we are mammals, and thus kind of the social aspects of the world matter to us. And during adolescence, kind of the idea here is that we're more theoretically sensitive to social cues, and so thus maybe the form of message may be more likely to matter to an adolescent than the content. So again, if you're screaming at a adolescent, they may be more focused because they're more sensitive to kind of social cues on the act of yelling or anger rather than the content of the message. However, there is a lot of variation in that. If you have kind of a strong relationship with the person who is like yelling at you, and maybe have expectations of like, yeah, they might yell at me, but ultimately they care about me, they love me. Also, they're not, this is not like this is not a long-term, they hate me kind of situation. It's just kind of a educational moment. These kind of effects are decreased. And same kind of idea with the susceptibility to peer pressure. There's differences in the susceptibility to peer pressure, and at least the two things that are kind of negative, or perform behaviors that are negative in response to peer pressure. If you kind of have like a strong bond with parents, family, your community, maybe even school, we'll talk about that later on, than if you don't. Moving on to Vygotsky's social and cultural perspective. Vygotsky is typically talked about in all developmental textbooks, but it's always like this very, very, very brief write-up of Vygotsky, rather versus like Piaget, where they give him like multiple pages. And Vygotsky, they lay it out in like a paragraph or two, and then they kind of just move on, and then they kind of give a bunch of excuses for it. But I'm going to take some time to talk about Vygotsky because this is a real theory and an important one, and especially when talking about like cross-cultural research. So Vygotsky argues that culture and society play a pivotal role. Intelligence is held by the group. Education doesn't just teach facts, it shapes how we think about the world generally. Piaget argued, argued and noticed that formal operational thought, which is a stage of Piaget's theory, is rarely used in some cultures. So this is basically a challenge to Piaget's theory. Vygotsky expected cognitive development to vary from society to society. It depends on the mental tools that a culture values and makes available. Children acquire mental tools by interacting with parents and other more experienced members of the culture. So kind of the idea here is that in Piaget's theory, it's really just kind of like children and adolescents learning alone, free of social influence, and it's very like cognitively based. So basically kind of like free of culture, free of kind of like social learning, but just a set of stages that you learn independently, and then you kind of learn those kind of abstract thinking, and then boom, you can think like an adult. Vygotsky is arguing, no. Intelligence and ways of thinking are held by the group, by the culture, by elders in a community, by the country maybe. And thus, elders, those group teaches students. That is how people develop, is through kind of like this younger children and adolescents working with more experienced members of the group. And these little mental tool things and what you learn specifically in the stage, and he's not a stage theorist, but where you kind of, your cognitive development depends on the culture you live in, because different societies kind of value different things, different forms of intelligence, different information, different ways of viewing the world, understanding the world. And I'm not going to talk about this in detail because it's a lot of information, but I did include slides if you want to check it out. But I will talk about some aspects of it. Scaffolding, for example, learning mechanism in which parents provide initial assistance in children's learning, but gradually remove structure as children become more competent. Relatedly, the zone of proximal development, the gap between what a learner can accomplish independently and what he or she can accomplish with the guidance and encouragement of a more skilled partner. There are skills within the zone, skills at which instruction should be aimed, and skills outside the zone, either well mastered or still too difficult. So scaffolding, this is kind of related to construction, scaffolding, is kind of the idea is that, again, because intelligence, ways of thinking about the world is held by the group, those group levels, parents, extended family, community members, whatever, in the process of learning, provide assistance and structure and support to the child as they learn. But as the child learns and grows, that kind of structure is slowly removed, so then the child can perform the task by themselves and then also, act independently, complete it in a self-sufficient way that allows them to contribute to the group, kind of. So kind of, for example, kind of not a little more easy to understand example, training wheels on a bicycle. You give a child training wheels, maybe you're an adult and you're holding onto the bike as well with the child. And so you're kind of giving them a lot of assistance. But as the child gets a little better, maybe you let go of the bike or don't hold on to the bike as often. And then eventually you get rid of the training wheels. You give them a big boy or big girl bike, and then they're off to the races. And now let's talk about this zone of proximal development. So kind of the idea here is that the experts, the kind of community elders, the group, who the adults of kind of a culture, of society, of community, family, basically have an understanding of what skills should be learned and kind of where a child should be in their skill development. So for example, we have the skills within the zone. So say, for example, I'm teaching mathematics, and I'm teaching a 6-year-old, and I say, okay, 6-year-old, today you are going to learn trigonometry. Well, that skill is going to be outside the 6-year-old's capabilities. They do not have the skills, they don't have the capabilities of achieving that skill, learning that skill at that particular age, because trigonometry is outside of their zone of proximal development. It's too difficult. Or another way, say, and this is our psychology class, I say, all right, so your final exam will be saying your ABCs. Well, that skill is already mastered and really not appropriate for emerging adults in their early 20s. Instead, you should focus on skills within their zone. So basically, I have an understanding of what you should know based on listening to this lecture, what your writing ability should be, what your reading ability should be, and based on my expertise, my knowledge as whatever, a scholar in this field, and a writer, I know that I should aim to assess you based on where I think you should be in those particular skills. That is, skills within your zone. And moving on to this kind of little slide here, kind of a big takeaway, as I said before, children can acquire skills and master tasks at different rates. Children internalize the problem-solving techniques that are discovered through collaboration, eventually being able to use the techniques on their own. So unlike Piaget, who has specific stages that you only reach at a particular age or after a particular previous stage hit, here you develop skills at different rates, and you do so through collaboration. You're not doing it alone. You're again working kind of with the group and with the idea to eventually allowing you to independently do some kind of task and then ultimately teach someone else and be part of that larger group of educators. And particular skills can develop at different rates because different cultures value different skills more or less than other cultures. Some implications include that thus really no single test or score can adequately reflect the range of a person's knowledge because, again, different cultures value different kind of forms of thinking, different skills. A meta-analysis found that each year of schooling adds 1.5 additional IQ points. This demonstrates that the concept of intelligence is wrapped up in particular kinds of cognitive skills acquired through cultural learning. Development consists of moving towards your upper range of your proximal zone. So kind of the idea here is, again, that we know and have found historically that each year of schooling adds, again, 1 to 5 points on your IQ score. So therefore, your IQ test must be measuring a specific form of skill sets or a specific way of thinking that is a form of thinking, but again, has some kind of cultural component into it. Thus, why every time, if you go to some rural, you go to rural Democratic Republic of Congo and introduce them to specific forms of education, each year that they spend in those forms of education are going to increase their IQ test scores, which suggests to us that there's some kind of cultural education going on, and that test is measuring that kind of cultural education. And as stated, the idea is that that we all have basically a zone of development. And basically the goal of development is to move a learner from kind of the lower end of that zone to the upper end of that zone through collaborative learning within a scaffolded way. Now, unfortunately, Vygotsky died at 38 years old. Thus, one reason of many others, he didn't speak English, so he had to kind of deal with that English bias kind of thing. He didn't get as much play in the U.S. as he has more play in other in other countries, but in the U.S. did not get as much play because Piaget lived to 89 years old. And was Vygotsky included culture and all these other things that wasn't really hot in the U.S. at the time. So anyway, so that combination really kind of contributed to Vygotsky not being as well known and influential as Piaget. However, he's making a little comeback here. And kind of this bleeds into the importance to look beyond laboratory experiments and standardized tests to examine how cognitive changes of adolescence affects teenagers' day-to-day thoughts and actions. Study the practical side of adolescent thinking with respect to how people think about social situations and how they think about risk. So kind of almost going back to that Bronfenbrenner point and a little bit of Vygotsky here, they're basically arguing, this argument is, hey, it's a little bit different to perform kind of these risk-reward tasks in a lab setting versus kind of seeing how this plays out in the real world. How does this play in day-to-day thinking? How does this play into real-world, everyday behavior? To study the practical side of adolescent thinking, researchers look at how people think about social situations. Social cognition, the aspect of cognition that concerns thinking about other people, interpersonal relationships, and social institutions. Adolescents' conceptions of interpersonal relationships become more developed. Gains in the area of social cognitions help account for many advances typically associated with adolescence in the realms of identity, autonomy, achievement, intimacy, and sexuality. So basically what we're looking at here is that cognition applied to the social world. Because again, abstract cognitive thinking could be useful, but really we all operate in a social world with various social pressures. So thus kind of the idea here is, how do adolescents think about people, relationships, and our social institutions? And this is thought to be involved in, again, kind of the idea of identity, achievement, autonomy, intimacy, and sexuality. So let's make that a little more concrete by looking at social norms or social conventions. Norms, and that is defined as norms that govern everyday behavior in social situations. Conventions begin to be seen as arbitrary, often seen as nothing but social expectations and thus not sufficient for compliance. It's not against the law to say to blah, 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 to skip, to say something annoying. Adolescents eventually realize they regulate people's behaviors and coordinate interactions among people. Yes, it is maybe arbitrary, this social norm, but without social norms, people are up in your house at 3 a.m. blasting music, or everyone is skipping each other in line. It's fair/just. Conceptions of law, civil liberties, and rights. Adolescents come to believe that there are some rights that should not be restricted. It is not illegal to do whatever antisocial thing. With age, they also realize some rights must be restricted to benefit the community. So we have these norms that exist in society, and these are just kind of arbitrary things that exist in society, but are things that allow us to operate in a kind of way. Folks, we live in a society. So these kind of norms allow us to operate in a society. So kind of adolescents can start to view these norms, though, in kind of slightly annoying ways. So it could, they often, see these things, these norms, as just social expectations. But it's really not required, they believe, for example. So they would say something like, it's not against the law to skip the lunch line, or whatever, skip in line. It's not against the law to skip in front of Universal Studios line. It's not against the law, blah, blah, blah. So they're really kind of saying, oh, because it's not the law, therefore it's arbitrary, therefore you could just break it whenever you want. So it's a kind of a classic little thing. It's not against the law to do X, Y, Z. But over time, adolescents, as stated, yes, they recognize that, yes, these norms are arbitrary, but without them, you're going to have a lot more chaos. So is it illegal for your parents to blast music at 3 a.m. when you're trying to sleep? No. But that is not a social norm and incredibly annoying. Thus, norms are kind of are required to kind of exist in a fair, just, and to kind of like live in a society. And same kind of thing with laws and civil liberties. It's not illegal to, whatever, I'm going to go to the mall, even though I have COVID, I'm going to go to the mall and just cough on everything. Woo, I can do whatever I want. It's not illegal. Who cares? Like, whatever. Like, all those kind of, any kind of thing like that. It's, again, not illegal to do something that's, that you're doing, but you're doing an antisocial thing. But with time, basically, adolescents come to realize that, yes, there can be restrictions on your civil liberty and your right to do whatever the hell you want at all times. Those restrictions are required kind of for the good of the group, and obviously there's a lot of cultural variation on kind of that conclusion. But all people do have varying levels of that understanding that, hey, you can't do whatever the hell you want at all every single time. You can't just like open the door of a pilot's and be like, whoa, what's up, dude? Like, what's going on? like not really something you could just do, even though it does violate your civil liberties, your right to movement wherever you want. But in that case, hey, you're gonna accidentally like crash the plane. So please stay out of the pilot's cockpit. Now let's talk about one theory of risk-taking, this behavioral decision theory. It's an approach to understanding adolescent risk-taking in which are seen as the outcome of systematic decision-making processes. Adolescents identify alternative choices, identify possible consequences of each choice, evaluate costs and benefits of each consequence, assess the likelihood of each consequences, and combine all this information to make a decision. By age 15, adolescents have the same basic cognitive abilities as adults. However, adolescents do not always accurately interpret risk messages or understand what specific behaviors reduce risk like adults. So kind of the idea here is that, yeah, you have all these kind of basic cognitive abilities, yet risk-seeking behaviors is often seen to be higher in adolescents. So why is that? If you already have these kind of same basic cognitive abilities as adults, why do adolescents often take more risky decisions or not weigh the risk and rewards to the same extent? And this is kind of one theory and one kind of approach. And we'll talk about some reasons why. Some proposed reasons include that adolescents think more about peers' opinions and reactions. Adolescents pay more attention to rewards, whereas adults pay more attention to risks. However, there are emotional and contextual influences on risk-taking. The quality of adolescent decision-making declines when they are emotionally aroused. Much of risky decisions are made in emotionally aroused states. They spend more time with peers. Around adults, their decision-making are more adult-like. Around peers, especially unsupervised, they make fewer quality decisions. Also depends on what they believe their peers would do. They're less likely to play it safe if they are told peers would have done the same. One neuroimaging study found that increased activation in the reward processing brain networks when making safe driving decisions in the presence of their mother, and decreased activity when making risky ones. Individuals who are high in reward seeking and sensation seeking are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, both positive and negative. Adolescents with positive relations with parents are less likely to take risk. So basically, it's not always that they're making more taking more riskier decisions, but it depends on kind of the circumstances. One, adolescents. One proposed reason, though, is that adolescents are thought to maybe value their peers' opinions and reactions more, or to a large extent. Right? You know, your peers are not always the best kind of opinions to take into consideration. But also, kind of as stated, you have to put in the context of what adolescents make the most negative risky decisions. So around when they're emotional aroused, so which is quite often. So kind of they're around maybe having a good time or maybe angry. They're on their peers. They're unsupervised. Those kind of contexts, unsupervised, emotionally aroused, more likely to make a bigger risk, and they believe that their peers would take that risk. Makes them more likely to take a risk, a negative risk, I should say. So, but in the presence of adults, they're more likely to think more adult-like and make kind of fewer poor decisions. And even in the presence of peers, if there's kind of some kind of adult supervision, or even really the quality of a relationship with, again, your community, your family, it can impact kind of those negative risk-taking behaviors. So it's not that they're always taking making risky decisions, but in particular context. But kind of a problem, though, is that adolescents often find themselves in contexts wherein they're more likely to engage in negative risk-taking. So basically, the neuroimaging study is finding that increased activity in parts of the brains dealing with like reward processing, aka they're feeling good at higher rates when making safe, aka non-risky driving decisions in the presence of their mother, and decreased activity when making risky ones. So basically, you can see on a neurological level the impact of a parent or being around a adolescent, to such an extent that when the adolescence they understand that they made a good, positive choice, a safe choice, areas in their brain associated with rewards, feeling good, increases. And that kind of areas in the brains associated with like reward processing, again, these are broadly stated terms, feeling good decreases when making risky ones. So kind of that social expectation, that social context influencing not just behaviors, but literally kind of neurological activity. Now, I will also keep in mind that it is kind of important to take some risks. You have to take risk in life. The question is, what are kind of like some controls that in monitoring and supervision and kind of quality of relationships between adolescents and parents, extended family, community, the school, those kind of things influence the likelihood of like negative, super risky chance, whatever, drunk driving, something along those lines, versus like, woo, I'm going to try and go make a new friend today. Like that is a risk that you got to take. Like life involves risk taking, but the goal here is trying to reduce the most kind of negative forms of risk taking and ones that are frankly quite deadly at times. Okay, with that said, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.